Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. Recently, I was recording an episode of my podcast, Ghost Notes. The guest was my friend Nate Holder, who, among other things, makes music education resources for children, and he presented me with a fairly simple-sounding challenge.
But if I asked you, and I'm asking you now, on the spot, I don't know anything about music at all, right? Can you explain to me what a major scale is?
But as easy as that sounds, if you listen to the episode, you can hear my brain slowly breaking for like 5 straight minutes as I try to figure out how to actually do it. Since then, I've been kind of obsessed with this question, and while I'm still not sure I have a good answer, I've spent so much time on it at this point that it'd be almost irresponsible not to turn it into content, so let's do it. If I was talking to a visitor from a faraway galaxy, how would I explain what the major scale is? Let's start with the definition I actually use in my day-to-day life. The major scale is the major scale, also known as the Ionian mode. That's it. That's all I need. I've spent the last couple decades of my life immersed in a world where major is everywhere. Understanding the sonic and musical implications of that name is just part of my job, and when I'm talking to other Western musicians, I'd probably never bother breaking it down any further than that. Why would I? They know it too, and if you're watching this video, odds are so do you. But that's not enough for our alien friend. They're gonna need a little more. But that's okay, I can work with that. Music is a sound-based art form, so if I want to explain the major scale, I can just say it's the scale that sounds like this. Or to give you a bit more context, I might play you this, and tell you that's a major scale progression. I might even show you a couple songs like this, or this. Somebody once told me the world is gonna roll me, to help you understand what the major scale feels like to listen to. But Nate's an author, and he was talking about writing a book. Outside of very specific circumstances, books don't tend to play sounds. That's not an option for him, so let's say it's not an option for us either. For the rest of this video, I'm going to avoid playing any music. Can we explain major to our alien friend with just our words? Probably, but if they can't hear it, we're going to have to rely on theoretical structures. If we explain how to build the scale, they can play it for themselves. One of my favorite approaches here is harmonic construction. This starts by defining the quality of the one chord. That gives you a root, a third, and a fifth. That fifth can then be the bottom of your 5 chord, which adds 2 new notes, the 7th and the 2nd, and then the root can also be the top of your 4 chord, giving us a 4th and a 6th. All we have to do is decide the qualities of these 3 chords, and we get a scale for free. With this system in mind, I can define the major scale as the scale where the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord are all major triads. I might have to explain that a major triad is a chord with a root, a major third, and a perfect fifth, but beyond that, this explanation should work perfectly. Unless they don't know what a chord is. That might be tricky. But it's okay, we can explain that too. A chord is what you get when you play multiple notes at the same time. That creates harmony, with individual pitches combining to create a more complex, nuanced sound. They're a pretty important part of the Western musical tradition, and the major triad is one of the most fundamental chords out there. It's the most consonant collection of 3 notes, so 3 of them can form the basis of a very consonant scale. So, we good? No? Still confused? Well, okay. In the alien's defense, our modern concept of chords is really only a couple hundred years old. This explanation wouldn't make much sense to like an 11th century Italian monk either. So, fine. No chords. Only scales. That leaves us with intervallic construction. I'm not as big a fan of this one, but it's pretty easy to explain. The major scale is a scale with all the major and perfect intervals. That's why it's called major. But the reason I don't love this is it feels like it's starting to lose track of a really important question. Why? I mean, it's called the major scale because it has all the major intervals, which are called major intervals because they're in the major scale, which is called the major scale because it has all the major intervals, and what are we doing? What's the point? If I want to tell you what the major scale means, I can't just tell you the notes. I also have to explain what makes those notes special. And the simple answer here is that major intervals are generally more consonant than their minor counterparts, and perfect intervals are the most consonant of all, so we're just taking all the prettiest intervals and putting them together in a very pretty scale. And that's sort of true, with one glaring exception. Most musicians I know wouldn't describe the major seventh as a consonant, certainly not compared to the minor seventh. So while the prettiest scale theory isn't too far off, it's not the full picture. In fact, there's another dissonant note that we have to worry about as well, the perfect fourth, although that's dissonant in a slightly different way. The major seventh is acoustically dissonant. That is, if you play the two notes together, which I'd love to demonstrate, but that's against the rules of the exercise, but if you did, their frequencies don't line up in any satisfying way, so you get this rough, jagged sound. There's no clear harmony. The perfect fourth, on the other hand, is acoustically fine. If you play just those two notes, it sounds downright pleasant. Instead, the fourth is contextually dissonant. In Western scales, one of the most important questions is what the third sounds like. The entire character of a scale depends in many ways on whether it's got a major third or a minor third. If it's major, then the perfect fourth is really acoustically dissonant with that, so hearing a perfect fourth in a major scale context evokes a sort of implied tension, even if no one's actually playing the third. This can also explain why we use a major seventh. While it's true that the minor seventh is less dissonant when played with the root, it's a lot more dissonant if you play it with the major thirds. We stick with the major seventh to protect the tonality of the scale. Again, contextual dissonance overrules acoustic dissonance. If we remove these two dissonant notes, we get a 5-note scale called major pentatonic, which does sort of fit with our prettiest scale theory, but adding them back in makes something with a much more active cycle of tension and release. There's the calm, serene backdrop of major pentatonic, but also these two notes that feel like they need to resolve to somewhere else, which we can use to create a sense of motion. And importantly, they want to resolve in opposite directions. The major seventh goes up to the root, and the fourth goes down to the third. This gives the major scale a balanced sense of directionality. If we used a minor seventh instead, that'd probably want to drop down to the sixth, but then all our resolutions would be going down, and that's no fun. Choosing these two specific notes to drive the scale's tension allows for much more dynamic motion, with notes resolving in both directions, often at the same time. But honestly, I don't even think we've gotten to the real question yet. I mean, this is an alien we're talking about. What if they don't know what a scale is? In that case, none of this has been helpful. I've built a ladder that can lead you to the major scale, but the rungs don't go low enough for you to start climbing. In fact, another huge barrier here has probably been my use of staff notation. Maybe you know a different Western notation system, like guitar tab or piano roll, or maybe the system you learned is for a different kind of music entirely. Maybe you never learned any way of writing down music. Assuming you have an intuitive understanding of this sophisticated system of dots and lines means alienating a lot of people, along with most aliens, so for the rest of this video, I'm gonna stop notating things. Words and pictures only. With that in mind, what is a scale? The simplest answer is that it's a collection of notes that you can draw from for a piece of music. And sure, that's where it starts, but a scale is more than a list. If it weren't, you couldn't have multiple scales with the same notes, and yet we do. D major and B minor are the same pitch collection, but they're not the same scale. So, okay, a scale isn't just a list, it's an ordered list. A scale implies a hierarchy with certain notes sounding more important and central than others, and each pitch within a scale carries its own implied function, behavior, and character. The most important note in any scale is the root. Or actually, I should probably address this. For years I've gotten comments telling me that the thing I call the root is actually the tonic. And yeah, that's true. In music school we learned that roots are for chords and tonics are for scales. But here's the thing. I don't care. Tonic is a nonsense word. Yes, once you know it, you can work out why it's called that. Tone, tonal, tonic, fine, I get it. But when you're trying to explain something to someone who doesn't already know that thing, it helps to use words where your listener can correctly assume what they mean, and for most people, tonic means soda. I can take the time to define it in this context, but that's another thing you have to learn, and those add up. But root? You know what roots are. Things grow out of roots. Things are built from roots. Roots connect things to the ground, and they provide the foundation to support complex structures. It's a resonant metaphor that ties in with the actual function of the note, communicating important nuances clearly and efficiently. So while I understand the point of having different names, I think that when you're talking to non-experts, the benefits of calling it a root far outweigh the costs. That's why I do that. Just in case you were wondering. Anyway, each note in the scale has its own function, but for simplicity's sake, I'm going to break it down into two categories. You You have stable notes and unstable notes. Some scales are completely unstable, others are entirely stable, but in major, there's a good mix of both, which gives you room to create musical narratives with a sense of tension and release. We talked before about the 4th and the 7th, the two main dissonances in the scale, both of which resolve to very stable tones. On the other hand, notes like the root, 3rd, and 5th are pretty stable already, and the 2nd and 6th can play both roles. That's a bit of an oversimplification, but all we need is a starting point to get our alien friend to see how we think about the major scale. That alien might be getting confused though, because I said a scale is a collection of pitches, but I haven't actually given them any notes. I've been talking about scale degrees. What are the actual sounds? Well, that's kind of complicated, but the short version is that it doesn't matter. In Western music, most of our musical structures aren't based on absolute pitch. They're relative. This is because human pitch perception is also mostly relative. We hear relationships between notes much more clearly than exact isolated pitches. Not entirely, of course. Some people do have perfect pitch, which lets them identify notes by their absolute frequency, and there are some phenomena, like acoustic beating and combination tones, that are based on raw frequencies as well. But for the most part, if you play a scale with one starting note, it'll sound pretty much the same as that same scale starting somewhere else. Things get a little funky when you start playing with more extreme ranges, but within a given register, the ratios between frequencies matter far more than the frequencies themselves. But speaking of register, we have another problem. I said this scale has 7 notes. That's not that many notes. Does that mean all our songs have really limited ranges? Well, no, because of octave equivalency. What's that? Right. Okay, let's talk about octaves. An octave is a special kind of interval where the frequencies overlap so well that if you play them together, they kind of blend into a single note. Specifically, the octave happens when you have two notes whose frequencies form a ratio of 1 to 2, so that every cycle in the lower note lines up with every other cycle in the higher one. Because notes an octave apart sound so similar, we decided to treat them as basically the same note, just in different registers. As such, I only need to give you 7 distinct notes for the major scale, and then you can translate those up and down in octaves to fill out the rest. I should note that this isn't true of every music culture on Earth, and it's not exactly true of historical European music either, but it's true of modern Western music, and that's where the major scale lives. In fact, thinking about intervals in terms of frequency ratios opens up another way of building major. All we need is one more interval, the perfect fifth, which has a ratio of 2 to 3. If you pick a root, then go up 5 perfect fifths, the notes you hit along the way form most of the major scale built off that root. If you then take those 6 notes and arrange them in the order they appeared on this ladder of fifths, you get a sort of spectrum of functions, from stable on one side to unstable on the other. The first couple notes are really strong and consonant, the last one is definitely dissonant, and in the middle you get a happy medium with notes that sound colorful but still at rest. But we're missing a note. We stopped too soon, and the scale we've built so far has a big awkward gap between the third and fourth notes. If we want to fill that, we could try going up another perfect fifth from our last note, but that would give us a different scale called Lydian. If we want to stick with major, we have to instead go back to our root and drop down a perfect fifth from there. Why do we do it that way? That's a big question, but one reason that seems easy enough to explain is that notes on the ends of our chain of fifths are going to feel less stable than notes that have perfect fifths on both sides, so we don't want the root to be quite at the bottom. However, that explanation might be a bit misleading because these days our perfect fifths aren't actually 2 to 3 ratios. They used to be a long time ago, but every interval in the major scale has its own ideal ratio, and if we do use pure perfect fifths, a lot of the other notes get wildly out of tune. I could go through and tell you all the correct ratios, but I'm not going to bother because we don't really do that either. Instead, we just use a slightly smaller perfect fifth with a ratio of 1 to 2 to the 7/12. It looks weird, but it's incredibly close to that 2 to 3 target, and it makes the rest of the math work out a lot nicer. So if you really want to hear what major sounds like for modern Western musicians, you should probably just use this number instead. But let's forget about the perfect fifth. We don't need it anymore. Instead, let's just look at the notes themselves. One way of thinking about scales is that they subdivide the octave. Again, you can pick any root you want and play it in as many octaves as you want. According to the rules of Western scales, that's all free. The point point of picking a specific scale is to fill the space in between. Let's start with an octave, and then we'll chop it up into 12 evenly spaced sections. Why 12? I don't know, it's a nice number, lots of factors, and it lets us approximate many of those important frequency ratios we were looking at earlier. Don't think too hard about it, just do 12. Now let's try to add 6 extra notes distributed as evenly as possible. It won't be perfectly even. It could be if we only added 5 notes, but we don't actually want that. Some small imperfections give the scale a lot more character, and they help orient you within the structure. If everything's even, then nothing is pointing anywhere, so we'll add 6 notes, giving us something like this. Now this isn't a major scale, but it is the right pitch collection. All we have to do is find the root. And again, the slight imperfections will help orient us. There should be 2 pairs of notes that are closer together than the others, in this case here and here. Actually, for clarity, I'm going to add a second octave's worth of notes to this so we can see how the scale wraps around. Anyway, because we have an odd number of notes per octave, the 2 gaps between our note clusters will be slightly different sizes. If we take the smaller gap and then take the 2 notes from those clusters that are closest to each other across that gap, those notes are the root and third of a major scale. This may seem a little convoluted as an explanation, but it does have some advantages. First, it requires basically no musical knowledge beyond what an octave is. And second, it shows off some really useful properties of the major scale. That even distribution thing is a big part of what makes the major scale so special, and finding the root and third by looking for where the notes cluster together helps illustrate those consonant notes' relationships to their neighboring dissonances. So yeah, if I had to explain the major scale to an alien, I think that's how I'd do it. There's a classic question in science about how to explain the concept of left and right to an alien when you can't share any physical landmarks, and the answer there is roughly the same. Drill down as far as you can into the shared language of math and physics. But Nate didn't actually ask me to explain the major scale to an alien. He asked me to explain it to a child, and no 5-year-old is going to follow along when I start talking about frequency ratios and maximally even distributions. It's too abstract. Can we make it more concrete? Sure, all you need is a nearby piano. A common approach here would be to tell you that if you play all the white keys from C up to the next C, that's C major. I might have to tell you how to find C, but that's not hard. It's the white key on the left side of the pair of 2 black keys. Easy. But I really don't like this approach. Human beings are incredibly good at noticing patterns. It's what makes us so smart, but it can also trip us up when we encounter patterns that don't actually mean anything. Imagine for a second that you know nothing about music and you've never seen a piano before. If all I tell you is that C major is all the white keys from C up to C, what's D major? Yeah. That's what I thought. We're not born knowing that scales are defined by their interval structures. That's something you have to learn, and if I start by giving you a different, easier pattern to recognize first, that's something you have to unlearn before you can move on. Instead, I'd probably start by having you identify different intervals, like the octave and the perfect fifth, over a couple different starting notes. That introduces the idea of counting the number of keys between different pitches, which I can then use to introduce the stepwise structure of the major scale. You know, whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Then, once you can play a generic major scale, I'd go back to C and point out that if you do that pattern from there, you hit all the white keys. The major scale is such a foundational part of the Western musical tradition that we literally built it into one of our most iconic instruments. How cool is that? But what if you don't have a nearby piano? That's fine. I actually think it's easier to explain scales on guitar because the shapes don't change. You don't have to worry about black and white keys, it's just frets and strings, and those are always consistent. Well, except for the B string, but I'm not getting into the B string right now. Or open strings, but again, not dealing with it. Point is, if you learn a scale shape with pretty much any root, you can slide your hand up and down the neck to play that same scale on pretty much any other root. So let's start by putting your left hand middle finger on any fret on either of the 2 thickest strings. Guitarists call these the lowest strings, but I'm avoiding that because while they play the lowest notes, they're in the highest physical position. Anyway, middle finger, any fret except the first one, and pluck that string. Next, place your pinky 2 frets up on the same string and pluck that. Then go up a string and in order, go index finger, middle finger, pinky, up a string again, index, ring finger, pinky. And that's it. That's a major scale. You can play a major scale. That should probably... Sorry, what's that? You don't have a guitar either? What about a trumpet? I can work with a trumpet. No? How about a theremin? Nothing? You know what? That's fair. Relying on instruments is kinda cheating anyway. After all, most Western instruments are built with the major scale in mind. If you're not already familiar with the Western musical tradition, it's unreasonable to assume you'd have access to the specific instruments of that tradition, so these explanations only really work for children who don't need them. If I assume that everyone's childhood looks basically like mine, then sure, instruments work. But if I want to make sense to people with different cultural backgrounds, I can't rely on tools that are specific to just one. So, fine, no instruments. But do you have a voice? If so, I can ask you to sing a note and then sing a different note. Now, I can't know for certain, but I suspect the main difference between those two notes was the pitch. I could maybe try to ensure that by asking for a higher note, but again, high and low are just metaphors. Not every culture uses the same ones. While high and low make sense to Western audiences, other cultures have described them as sharp and heavy, small and large, thin and thick, or young and old. There's no reason a high note should be called high except that we're used to calling it that, so I'll just stick with different. Anyway, once you have two notes, I can start to explain the concept of an interval. Editing Corey here, realizing a little too late that I probably shouldn't just say I'd explain what intervals are. I should probably actually do it. An interval is a measure of how far apart the two notes are. Try this, sing your notes again and pay attention to how each one physically feels to sing. If they feel pretty similar, there's probably a fairly small interval between them. If they feel really different, that's a large interval. If it helps, you can repeat the exercise, singing different pairs of notes and seeing which ones feel more or less similar to each other to get a sense of what different sized intervals are like. This is, again, a lot easier to demonstrate on an instrument where you can see the physical distance, but the voice is the only instrument you're born with, so it's the one we've got to use. From there, I can tell you that certain intervals are considered special by Western musicians, and the most special of all is the octave. Two notes an octave apart sound so good together that we think of them as kind of being the same thing. But octaves are very large intervals. If you sang a note and then went up in octaves, you'd probably only get one or two more pitches before your voice couldn't reach the next one. It's a big space, so we add other notes to give us more options. Once we have a starting note and some extra different notes in between, we call that a scale. And the most important scale in Western music is major. Here, we try to spread the notes out pretty evenly so there's no awkward gaps, and we have a mix of different kinds of notes that sound different with our root. This gives us lots of opportunities to tell all kinds of musical stories depending on which parts of the scale we focus on. I might not be able to get you to hear it, but I think from that starting point, you can at least begin to imagine what the major scale is like. But that's where I've run into a wall. What happens if the two notes you sang aren't different pitches? Like, I think they would be. As far as I know, that's a safe assumption across cultures, but maybe that's not true. Maybe some children would be more likely to sing notes with two different timbres or two different durations, and I just don't know that because that's not how I was raised. Or what if the child reading it is deaf? My whole explanation relies on you being able to produce a pitch that you can hear, but that's not a given either. And to those points, my honest answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure how to take this deeper. I'm not sure it can go deep enough to really catch every single person, let alone make sense to an alien, but I think it's worth it to try. Not because the major scale is just so fundamentally important that every human being needs to know how it works, but because stripping our musical ideas down to their bare necessities reveals the assumptions we make about how music works. And even if we're okay with those assumptions, we're still better musicians if we know that they're there. So I encourage you to give this a shot. Pick up where I left off, or take another seemingly basic music concept and try to explain it without assuming any prior knowledge. See how far you can get, and if you want, leave a comment to share your work. I had a lot of fun with this, and I hope you do too. Oh, and before I go, if you want to hear my full conversation with Nate, that episode of Ghost Notes is currently only available on Nebula. I'll put a link in the description to sign up for Nebula so you can check that out now, or if you don't mind waiting, it'll be coming out on all the normal podcast platforms next month. Plus, there's over 2 years of episodes to listen to right now if you need something else to fill the time. And hey, thanks for watching. Thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible. An extra special thanks to our featured patrons, Kevin Wilamowski, Susan Jones, Jill Sundgaard, Duck, Howard Levine, Warren Huart, Damian Fuller-Sutherland, and John Hancock. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. Oh, and don't forget to like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.